kind of talk about how that plays into our understanding of our of word level reading and teaching at the high school level, and then identify the role of vocabulary and background knowledge in helping us to understand reading. So, what is the simple view of reading? The simple view of reading is a scientific theory that attempts to explain how a student reads, um, and what the different processes that they rely on. So it is it looks at comprehension as the byproduct of reading, and so we want to think about what does it mean to comprehend a text. Okay, so I took this definition, and we're going to use it a couple of times in this slideshow, but this is a definition from a book from 2014 called How the Brain Learns to Read. And it has a nice definition of text comprehension. Text comprehension occurs when readers derive meaning as a result of intentionally interacting with the text. Such comprehension is enhanced when readers actively relate the ideas represented in print to their own knowledge and experiences and can construct mental representations in their memory. Hence, good readers are both purposeful and active. I like that because it talks a lot. I think there's room for motivation and a lot of what we know about our students when it comes to a lot of what you're saying in your perusal comments indicates that you really are very aware of the role that creating classroom cultures and environments that are inviting, relating learning to students' experiences, all of that is I think encompassed in this definition, but so too are the other aspects of reading that we talked about in the first reading by Frankel. What is reading? Because really what we know is that reading is a combination of really two factors. This is called the simple view of reading. This is the view that the state of Ohio really bases a lot of their literacy achievement plans on. So it's something good to be familiar with, because it is something that a lot of the upcoming trainings and initiatives in the state are going to be based on. And so simple view of reading is this idea that we comprehend text because of word recognition, actually being able to decode and understand what the word says on the page. Language comprehension, which are those skills like being able to draw inferences, being able to understand the meaning of words, as in the vocabulary of words, being able to understand how to adjust or make decisions based on context and audience and things like that. And it's important to consider that the simple view of reading is presented to us as a mathematical equation. And this might be the most math I can give you. So some of you that are math majors, this is about it. But we know that anything times 0 is 0. So when we think about the simple view of reading, we want to think about the fact that we actually need both sides of the equation. We need some word recognition. We need language comprehension in order to get reading comprehension. And so when we think about that, our students can come in as poor decoders and have really strong vocabulary and a lot of background knowledge and a lot of in the right motivation to read. So they're strong on the language comprehension skills, but they're 0 because anything times 0 is 0. But the opposite can be true. They can be able to decode a word, and you will occasionally run into these students. They call them hyperlexic. You will find students that they come in, they are strong decoders, but they don't have the vocabulary. They can't draw inferences. They can't relate to what they're reading. Therefore, they can't comprehend. And the other thing that we want to think about is if we think of this in terms of like a 5-point scale, 5 being great, weakness on either side really has, because it's a multiplication and not an addition, weakness on either side really has a profound effect on our students' reading comprehension. And so that's kind of the simple view of reading. It takes a really complex idea and it makes it really simple, but it's, we have to think about it in terms of what does this help us to understand about poor readers. So students can have deficits in a number of ways. So if you look at this axis, okay, this is poor word recognition, okay, and this would be this axis is word recognition, this axis is language comprehension. So down here would be poor word recognition, and over here would be language comprehension. So what we can have is we can have students that dyslexics tend to be really high in language comprehension, so they're up on the language comprehension axis, but they're low in the decoding access, okay? So those students that are dyslexic, they do tend to have strong vocabulary. They do tend to have, so it's when we look at dyslexia, and I'll talk a little bit about dyslexia later, when we look at dyslexia, it would be an unexpected difficulty because when you look at that, when you hear them talk or when you engage in inference making during a read aloud or something like that, you're able to see those skills, but you're not able to see it when they have to do it on their own, when they have to decode the words on their own. So that's dyslexia. Now that's different than a generalized reading disability, which is somebody who neither has the language comprehension skills. They don't have the background knowledge. They don't seem to be able to draw inferences. They don't seem to be strategic in their reading, but they also can't decode words. Okay, so that's the decoding piece. That's where having weak decoding skills. You could also have um, weak decoding or strong decoding skills, but weak language comprehension. And this is where you would call hyperlexia. Some students on the autism spectrum might exhibit that, where they are able to decode words really well. They could read something, but when they're done reading that passage, you ask them what it meant, they don't know what it meant. So they were precise in their decoding, but they weren't able to process it. That would be what we call hyperlexia. And then our typical readers, our skilled readers, are going to be high in both, right? They have a balance of the language comprehension and the decoding skills or the word recognition skills. When we think about our students, I want you to know that this is a graphic that the state of Ohio uses quite a bit in their trainings for teachers. We really do know that about 10 to 15% of our students are going to be somewhere in that low decoding, and often they're going to be dyslexic, okay? And so 10 to 15% of our students are going to have decoding or word recognition issues. About 40 to 50% of our students are going to be in that where they've got weak skills. Their skills are weakened in that area, but they exist, but they limit their ability to achieve. As opposed to about 40% of our students are probably going to be on that part of the axis where we have the strong decoding and the strong word recognition. Now, as I said, we called it the simple view of reading, but we know that the processes that are involved in both sides of that equation are actually quite complex. And so Hollis Scarborough actually came up with this model to explain the simple view of reading, and it talks about what goes into those ropes. So under word recognition or decoding, we want our students to be able to have sight recognition, meaning that they're familiar words, they're able to read it nearly automatically. We also want to make sure that they are able to decode, meaning that they understand the alphabetic principle, they can sound out words. And so that comes up with phonological awareness, which is being able to like hear the parts of the word so that you can sound them out and decode them. So that's word recognition. Those are foundational skills, and those are generally and hopefully taught before our students get to us in secondary schools. But we understand that not always, and we understand that for some students, there's challenges and difficulties. So it could very well be that those students continue to struggle through longer than you would expect, right? So maybe they'll be the ones that have the 0.2 or the 0.5 on that part of the equation, and just aren't as strong. So then on the language comprehension side, the other piece is where we're going to look at a lot when we're dealing with adolescents, and that's things like background knowledge, vocabulary. Do they understand language structures? Do they understand syntax and semantics? Are they able to follow a complex sentence all the way through? Do they have verbal reasoning? Can they draw inferences? Do they understand metaphorical thinking, language like that? And do they have literacy knowledge? Do they understand things like print concepts and genres? Now, listen, I understand that there are greater, and that this is an incomplete model as well, because we have things like creating a purpose for reading, which you had talked about quite a bit in your perusal comments. We have motivation. We have this idea of students wanting to have agency, maybe choice, and all of those things. So we know that language comprehension and word recognition, these are the components of instruction, right, that are really important for instruction. We also know that there are other components that have a lot more to do with management, relationship building, and maybe design, right? But what I want to point out is what the model says is that all of these skills get woven tighter and tighter so that they become nearly automatic and our students become skilled readers. So the decoding, the word recognition becomes increasingly automatic, and the language comprehension skills become increasingly strategic so that our students can become skilled readers. So the simple view of reading and Scarborough's rope help us to understand sort of all these two different pieces of the reading process. I'm gonna skip this just because I don't. You need this. I picked it, but I don't. It won't let me skip. Hold on a second. Sorry. Okay. All right. Now, oops. Okay. Sorry about that. Text comprehension, though, we know that it occurs when readers derive meaning as a result of intentionally interacting with the text. Such comprehension is enhanced when readers actively relate their ideas presented to text to their own knowledge and experiences. And this is where, and this is what we're going to be looking at, this is where things like background knowledge and vocabulary can help us, because what we want is for our students to be able to construct mental representations that go into their short-term memory, move into their short-term memory, into the long-term memory. And so good readers are both purposeful and active. And to be able to relate our reading to our experiences and our knowledge, we have to bring in knowledge. We have to mean background knowledge, and we have to bring in vocabulary knowledge. So what do good readers do? Good readers will be able to do a number of things, but I want to kind of give you a scenario about that kind of illustrates. If you were to predict, you are about to present a text that is about baseball. Who do you think in your classroom is going to do the best? Do you think your strong readers, those that demonstrate both sides of the equation of the simple view of reading, are they going to do the best on this passage? Are the kids who are going to have knowledge of baseball, are they going to do better regardless of where they end up on the on that continuum of skilled reading, even if they maybe have some word recognition skills? Are they going to do better? Or will it make no difference? Strong readers and kids with knowledge of baseball will perform the same at the task. This was a question that that actually was part of a study, an experimental study in 1987 that involved 64 students. These students were taken into a room with a model of a baseball field and a fictional account of a game. So participants were asked to read a fictional account of the game and then use the model to demonstrate, to basically show that they understood, they were able to make sense of the text. And so it had passages like this: Cherniak swings and hits a ball, bouncing the ball towards the shortstop. Healy comes in, fields it, and throws it first, but too late. Cherniak is on first with a single. So what they would have is the students read that passage, and then they would go into their model and they would show the ball going to the shortstop throwing to the first baseman, but the player making it anyways safe. So that was the experiment. And they wanted to find out what role did background knowledge, what was more important, basically, background knowledge or reading ability. And what they found was the prediction, if you predicted that kids with knowledge of baseball did better, that's actually true. So the reading ability made little impact on how well the students understood the story, but the knowledge of baseball did. Now, granted, we're talking about a certain threshold. All of these kids could decode. Some of them just couldn't decode very well, or were behind grade level in their word recognition skills. So they didn't have 0 on the equation, but they might have had a very small number on that part of the equation. But because they had knowledge of baseball, they came in with very strong language comprehension. So prior knowledge creates a scaffolding for information. For poor readers, the scaffolding allows them to compensate for their generally inefficient recognition of important ideas. So this was a study, 1987. They really helped us to understand, wow, background knowledge is really, really important. So what they say here is that sometimes we focus as teachers, we want to teach them reading strategies, like very common one in high school. I'm going to teach my students how to write a good summary of what they've read. That's going to be my strategy. That's how I'm going to help to support their reading comprehension. But the question you have to ask is, if you don't know if you have zero knowledge of baseball, if you've never been to a baseball game, how could you effectively summarize this passage, right? You wouldn't be able to put it in or paraphrase it, which is another common strategy that we use in high school. You just wouldn't be able to do that because you don't have the background knowledge. What about vocabulary? Vocabulary, what if the students had the vocabulary but not the experience? Vocabulary is important. That definitely has been demonstrated to be true. But even when controlled for vocabulary, knowledge really does predict a lot of the variance in reading achievement. So an example they had was in a follow-up study, researchers gave students who were Catholic a passage about Mass. And then with the other kids, they taught the vocabulary and gave them the vocabulary knowledge that they might use in this passage, and then gave them the passage. And again, even when we controlled for reading ability, the students that had experience attending a Mass actually did better than the students who didn't attend that, who had no experience, even if they had some direct instruction about the vocabulary in the passage. So background knowledge then helps us to develop understandings of concepts, kind of create mental images of objects, and allows us to perspective take so that we can use our experiences to be able to understand and come to bear in a passage. So there's a really good book, it's about 3 years old now, called the Achievement or the Knowledge Gap. And really what she argues is that the achievement gap, the lack of achievement that we see between our poor students and our students of color and our students with disabilities often has to do with this background knowledge. Because elementary students often get all their reading instruction through a skill-based approach, which is often very necessary for decoding, students are given limited texts that build their background knowledge. So while the skilled readers are reading novels and reading historical texts and learning about, science and nature, the students that are on the lower end are still working with very simple texts, but they're working on these skills-based practices. So the texts are accessible so that they can summarize, or they can find the main idea, or they can build their word recognition skills, but they aren't introducing them to these history, math, or STEM concepts that they're going to need in the future, that they're going to need in your classroom, right? I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second because I didn't say that I was going to. I need to say that I'm going to share the sound here, and I want to optimize for a video clip. But I wanted to show you a very short interview with the author of The Knowledge Gap.
Those tests, which have become the yardstick by which we measure progress, you look at them and they seem to be measuring reading comprehension skills. They're asking kids, so read this passage, find the main idea, make inferences. And so teachers naturally, and administrators, they think, well, that's what's being tested are those skills, so we need to just double down on drilling kids on those skills, overlooking the fact that one reason kids often score low on those tests is they don't have the background knowledge to understand the reading passages in the first place. It's not that they can't make an inference. They make inferences in their lives all the time, Yep. Even toddlers can make an inference. Sure. So that's not the problem so much as they lack the background knowledge and vocabulary to understand the passage. And that has been a big problem that's been overlooked.
Okay, so background knowledge.
Those tests, which have become the yardstick by which we measure progress, you look at them.
All right. So what this tells us then is that background knowledge really does matter, and that when we are talking about background knowledge, let me get share here. Talking about background knowledge, we really want to think about, do our students have experiences? And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to make these connections for our students. But the other thing that we can do, the other aspect that she talked about, is this aspect of vocabulary. I thought this was interesting. 10,000 words account for about 90% of text written in this country. So if our students can master 10,000 words, which is a lot of words to be fair, but if our students can master 10,000 vocabulary words, they're actually going to be able to understand 96% of text. I thought that was fascinating when you think about there's something like I forget over 3 million words in the English language. Um, our students come into school. There's a gap right away. Our students that come from higher socioeconomics statuses come in with often 1 million words more than our students who don't. And so what we want to, I'm sorry, there's 30 million words in the English language. Only about 10,000 show up for 96%. And our students, there's a gap even before they start school. So when we think about reading instruction, we want to know what basically this is an issue of equity. We want to make sure that all of our students have the same opportunity to access our content. So we want to think about vocabulary in terms of tiers. And so we want to really focus in on this tier 2 and in our case, in disciplinary, tier 3 words that might really help our students to understand the passages. Tier 2 words are going to be those words that are, they come in pretty high frequency. Tier 2 words give a lot of bang for your buck. So if you're, nevertheless might be a tier 2 word, or nullify, right? That's a tier 2 word that is kind of frequent. It's very academic sounding. It's not something that your students would have experience in when they were watching, say, SpongeBob, right? So that is something that they would, you could spend some time teaching them those tier 2 words. Also, tier 3 words are important. Those are those words that are kind of central to our discipline. And what's interesting is some words that we use are, they have a general meaning, and then when they have a specialized meaning, we also have to think about the fact that sometimes our students might assume a reading or a word means something that they know from as a tier 2 word, but actually it has a very specialized meaning in our discipline. So we want to think about that. So here's some ideas. So if a teacher says, look at that belt in an astronomy class, what do they mean? If a doctor says imaging of a solid mass on your gallbladder may be a calculus, what does that mean, right? If a plant is said to be in the fungi family, does that mean that plants live in social groups the same as humans? If a science teacher asks you to identify the mole in the experiment, should you be looking for an annoying creature that digs holes? If a computer scientist creates a patch, does that mean that she fixed torn genes, right? So that's something that you want to think about. So what we want to think about in terms of vocabulary is we really want to think about what do our students need to do to be able to understand our vocabulary. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, but Ohio does have a plan to raise literacy achievement, and there actually is a component in there, an adolescent literacy. And in that plan, they talk about these essential components of adolescent literacy, which is advanced word study, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and motivation. And so what they are talking about is this idea that these are all integrated into content areas and become the shared responsibility of all secondary educators and specialists who support learners across the grade range. So the Ohio Plan to Raise Literacy Achievement talks about disciplinary literacy as a understanding or framework for understanding how our students engage in literacy in the secondary school. They also talk about this idea of advanced study, and that's where your reading is going to come into play this week. Instruction for advanced study really teaches students how to read and spell multiple syllable words by using a combination of word analysis tools and structural analysis. So one of the things that we do, this is advanced word study, is not just giving the vocabulary word, but maybe having your students think about related words, maybe having your students think about it in terms of a continuum of meaning. So drab and dark, what actually is the more powerful word, so that idea of shades of meaning. It might have them look at structures, and this is where you're pulling on what we know from word recognition and what we know from background knowledge. So you're actually able to meet both sides of that equation, because the structural analysis has them look at things like meaningful units. Those are called morphemes. And so what we do is we have our students start to look at the meaningful units, look at the roots and the prefixes and the suffixes when they encounter a word, to try to get to understand what the word might mean. And it helps to focus them on the morpheme so that they can start to build it. They have a toolkit for how to start to make sense of a word that they've never met. So English is what we call a deeply morphemic language. we spell both the sounds and words, which means we do have phonemes and we do have letter to sound correspondences. We know they're not perfect. We know that we have more sounds than we have letters. So, that's the difference between a Spanish, where every sound has one, or every letter has one sound. But think about things like I. We know we have the long I and the short I sound. We know that that C can sometimes sound like an S, and it can sound like a K. So we know, we have a very complex language in that way. But what helps is we have what's called a morphemic language, which means that we have our meaning is represented in word parts. And so the thing that kind of complicates this is we have words that come from Greek or Latin, from French, from French, from Spanish. And there's a lot of the languages, Arabic languages. But when students start to know some of the parts and they know to look for the roots, then they start to be able to draw, they might know what no is, and thinking about knowledge in relation to know, and that if they know that ledge turns this into a noun, now all of a sudden they're able to understand knowledge, right? Same thing with house versus housing. Like they understand that housing might be a little bit more of a generalized, they know that the ing, that means a verb. So if they know what a house is, when I'm housing something, now that means that I'm holding on to something, that it's in my house. Those types of things. So we can teach our students to look at these meaningful morphemes in ways that maybe prepare them to be able to address both those tier 2 words, and also when we get into our tier 3 words. Although some disciplines are going to be more useful for that. Like, for instance, we know that science, learning some morphology, learning some of the Greek and Latin roots, for instance, is really going to help them make sense of like, what does physiology mean, right? So morphemes include prefixes, suffixes, and roots. And knowing these prefixes, suffixes, and roots allows our students to understand related words and apply their understanding of a word that they know to the new words that they encounter. And so in today's reading, what you're going to do is you're going to look at how this might look in a disciplinary literacy classroom, right? So disciplinary implications for both of these things. It is important to tie disciplinary learning to students' background knowledge. It is important to teach words that are both in tier 2 and tier 3 in your high school classroom. The tier 3 words, you want to get those words that are critical to getting to the content, right? The tier 2 words, you want to think about sometimes, when is my tier 2 word actually something much more specific in my classroom, right? Like the belt. And then we want to think about word study strategies like morphology, and how we can support students so that they don't just give up when they encounter a word that they don't know, and they're able to access a text even if there's some words that they don't know. Okay, so stop there. So, all right. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, have a good week.